Late August, 1944. The roads of northern France choke with retreating German armor. Trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons all crawling east under a blinding summer sun. Dust hangs in the air like smoke. Exhausted soldiers sit on tank hulls, faces streaked with grime and disbelief. The once mighty Wehrmacht is on the run. Then a distant hum. It grows into a thunder that rolls across the sky. Men look up, shading their eyes. From the west, out of the glare, silver specks dive. Fast, steady, deliberate. P-47 Thunderbolts. The air erupts in sound. 50 caliber tracers rip through the column. Gasoline trucks ignite like torches. Horses rear and scream. A Panzer tries to turn off the road, but a rocket slams into its side, tearing steel apart. Within minutes, the highway becomes a furnace. A moving army frozen in fire. As smoke boils upward, survivors stumble through wreckage, staring at the insignia on the wings. White stars on silver. The same pilots their officers once mocked as clumsy amateurs. Now those amateurs rule the sky. And from this moment on, every German soldier knows it. The war has changed forever. In the early years of World War II, air power was not yet understood as the decisive force it would become. Germany's Luftwaffe had dominated Europe through precision, discipline, and experience. Veterans of Spain, Poland, and France. Its fighter aces, flying the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and later Focke-Wulf FW-190s, were hardened professionals who saw themselves as masters of the sky. Across the Atlantic, America was still learning. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its air arm was inexperienced, its doctrine untested. Pilots fresh from training schools in Texas, Arizona, and California arrived in Britain wide-eyed, green, and uncertain. To German intelligence officers and propagandists, these men were barely a threat. Factory-made pilots, mass-produced in a hurry, lacking the instincts of born hunters. The Luftwaffe's arrogance wasn't entirely without reason. Early encounters confirmed their belief. In 1943, over the skies of occupied Europe, American bomber formations suffered catastrophic losses. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew deep into German airspace without adequate fighter escort. The P-38 Lightning and P-39 Airacobra could not reach Berlin or Hamburg. Fuel limitations meant they had to turn back before the bombers reached their targets. When the bombers continued unescorted, German interceptors tore through them with brutal efficiency. On missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, American losses reached staggering numbers. Entire formations decimated in a single raid. Luftwaffe commanders mocked the flying schools of the United States, claiming their pilots had no heart for close combat, no finesse for air duels, no respect for seasoned opponents. But beneath this overconfidence, Germany failed to see a storm building across the Atlantic. A machine born not from pride, but from industrial genius and sheer persistence. In 1943, American engineers at Republic Aviation introduced a fighter unlike anything the Luftwaffe had yet faced. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was not elegant. It was not nimble. German pilots laughed when they first saw it, calling it a milk jug with wings. The P-47 was massive, built around a single powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, one of the largest radial engines ever placed in a fighter aircraft. It could climb to over 40,000 feet, dive faster than any German plane, and soak up damage that would destroy a Messerschmitt instantly. American pilots learned quickly that they could take hits, keep flying, and strike back with overwhelming firepower. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns turned the P-47 into a flying buzzsaw. Yet early in 1943, even as the Thunderbolt entered service, the German belief persisted. The Americans lacked instinct. They believed that Yankee flyers relied too much on machines and not enough on raw skill. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland famously remarked that American pilots fight like factory workers and not hunters. But the war in the skies was changing faster than anyone could imagine. While German veterans counted their individual kills, the U.S. Army Air Forces focused on team coordination, high-altitude precision, and relentless production. Where Germany lost aces it could not replace, America trained thousands more. Where Germany built hundreds of fighters, America built thousands. And behind the numbers came doctrine, the understanding that air power could cripple an army not just in the air but on the ground. By late 1943, Allied command began to realize that the key to breaking Germany was not only destroying its cities or interceptors, but its very ability to move. Tanks, trains, trucks, and the arteries of war all became targets, and the Thunderbolt, once mocked as too heavy for dogfights, would become the perfect weapon for this new mission. The German confidence that American pilots lacked skill was about to meet the full roaring reality of American industry, technology, and adaptability. Because in war, skill alone is not enough. Survival belongs to those who evolve faster, and the Thunderbolt would prove evolution with wings. By the spring of 1944, the face of air war over Europe had changed completely. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter one, was now the hunted. Allied production lines flooded England with new aircraft, new pilots, and endless supplies of fuel and ammunition. The sky itself was becoming an Allied battlefield. The arrival of long-range escort fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, finally gave American bombers the cover they desperately needed. Deep inside Germany, where B-17s once fell by the dozen, they now flew shielded by Thunderbolts and Mustangs. The Luftwaffe, forced into constant defensive sorties, began to bleed. Fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and relentless Allied raids on airfields left Germany's once feared air force exhausted. But as the Luftwaffe fought for survival in the sky, a new war was beginning on the ground, one that would expose German soldiers to a kind of destruction they had never imagined. The P-47 Thunderbolt, originally designed for high-altitude escort, was suddenly reassigned a far deadlier purpose. In 1944, the 9th Air Force, newly formed and stationed in England, received orders to transform the Thunderbolt into a fighter bomber. Its task: prepare the way for the Allied invasion of Europe. The timing could not have been more crucial. The Allied command under General Eisenhower was finalizing plans for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. Air superiority was no longer just a luxury. It was the foundation upon which the invasion would succeed or fail. Every tank, every rail line, every convoy behind German lines had to be neutralized. And the Thunderbolt, with its unmatched durability, was built for punishment. Each sortie carried a mix of 500-pound bombs, high-velocity rockets, and 50-caliber firepower. The aircraft could dive steeply onto its target and pull away under intense flak, shrugging off hits that would tear lighter planes apart. Its thick armor plating around the cockpit often saved pilots who would otherwise have been lost. On the eve of D-Day, Allied pilots had already begun tearing apart northern France's infrastructure. Bridges were reduced to rubble, train yards left smoldering, and fuel depots vanished in firestorms. German columns moving to reinforce coastal defenses found themselves strafed at every turn. In June 1944, as the beaches of Normandy erupted with Allied troops, the skies above were alive with Thunderbolts. They flew cab-rank patrols, circling above the battlefield, awaiting ground calls for strikes. When a German tank formation was spotted, a forward air controller would radio the coordinates, and within minutes a squadron of P-47s would dive in, unleashing rockets and gunfire with devastating precision. To the men on the ground, the effect was horrifying. German infantry, who had once mocked American flyers, now ducked and prayed at the sound of the aircraft's roaring engine. Tanks were no longer safe under tree cover. Trucks burned where they hid. Columns that moved by day risked annihilation. Those that moved by night risked running out of fuel or time. The Luftwaffe could not protect them. For every German plane that managed to take off, 10 Allied fighters patrolled above. Flak batteries fired blindly into the clouds, but the Thunderbolts kept coming, their radial engines screaming through smoke and shrapnel. By July, the skies over Normandy had a new ruler. The Americans had learned. They had adapted. And now they were merciless. As the ground war pushed inland, Thunderbolts became the constant shadow of the German army. Roads became killing zones. Convoys disintegrated under rocket fire. One British observer described the aftermath as a battlefield of twisted iron where movement itself had become suicide. By late summer, even German officers began to admit what their propaganda had denied. These pilots were not clumsy or reckless. They were efficient, fearless, and utterly dominant. And soon, during the breakout at St. Lo and the encirclement at the Malaise Pocket, that dominance would reach its most terrifying expression. The place where arrogance met annihilation. They were young. Many were barely 20 years old. They came from farms in Kansas, cities like Chicago and New York, from quiet towns that had never seen war. By the time they reached England in 1944, these American pilots had logged barely a few hundred hours of flight time. yet they were about to face the most experienced army in Europe. Inside their cockpits, they lived between moments of calm and terror. Each sortie meant threading through anti-aircraft fire, engine roaring at full throttle, the sky alive with smoke and tracer lines. Yet in the chaos, discipline ruled. Stick to formation. Check your six. Dive, fire, climb. It wasn't glamour. It was endurance. The P-47 pilots of the 9th Air Force became a breed apart, not dueling in elegant dogfights, but plunging into the mud and fire of the battlefield. They flew low within sight of tanks, close enough to see the white faces of German drivers looking up in shock. When they returned to base, their aircraft often looked like wrecks. Punctured wings, shattered canopies, flak holes stitched across the fuselage. Yet most made it home, and the pilots, covered in sweat and dust, would climb out, grab a cigarette, and prepare for the next mission. Their courage didn't come from glory or revenge, it came from survival. They knew that every truck they destroyed, every bridge they dropped, shortened the war for the men fighting on the ground. To them, skill was no longer about elegant maneuvers or individual kills. It was about accuracy, teamwork, and endurance under fire. They weren't aces. They were instruments of overwhelming force. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was an engineering contradiction. It was the largest single-engine fighter of the war, weighing nearly 8 tons fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a Spitfire. Yet somehow it worked. Its heart was the R-2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial engine that could drag the aircraft to over 430 miles per hour, coupled with a supercharger that allowed it to climb above 40,000 feet. It made the Thunderbolt a giant that could fight in the rarefied air where bombers flew, or dive with deadly speed down to ground level. The cockpit was wrapped in armor plating. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The wide, rugged landing gear allowed the P-47 to operate from rough, hastily prepared airstrips near the front. It wasn't graceful, but it was almost indestructible. German pilots quickly learned that shooting down a Thunderbolt wasn't easy. Even when riddled with bullets, the P-47 could limp home on one cylinder, smoking and shaking, its pilot still alive. American engineers had built it to survive mistakes, and war is full of mistakes. Then came the firepower. 8 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of firing 3,400 rounds per minute. In ground attack mode, the Thunderbolt carried up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 rockets, enough to destroy anything short of a battleship. Against tanks, it was devastating. Rockets like the M8 High-Velocity Aircraft Rocket, HVAR, could punch through armor from 1,000 yards away. A single P-47 squadron could obliterate a column in minutes. The Germans called them Jabos, short for Jagbomber or fighter bomber, and the name soon carried the same fear once reserved for Stukas. The irony was cruel. The Luftwaffe, which had pioneered dive bombing in the early war, now watched its own tactics turned against it, by an enemy they once dismissed as clumsy amateurs. To German soldiers, the sound of a Thunderbolt was unforgettable. A deep metallic roar like rolling thunder, hence the nickname. It began as a faint vibration, then a growl, and finally a scream that filled the sky just before the rockets hit. Columns would freeze. Drivers would abandon their vehicles and dive into ditches. Panzer crews would scatter, hoping the trees could hide them. But the Thunderbolts saw everything. Their attacks came with terrifying precision, strafing first the lead and rear vehicles to trap the convoy, then tearing the rest apart. For men who had marched unchallenged across Europe just a few years before, the helplessness was unbearable. They could fight tanks, they could fight men, but not the sky. Survivors described scenes of chaos that defied imagination. Horses on fire, trucks overturned, ammunition exploding, smoke blotting out the sun. One officer later recalled, "It was not battle. It was slaughter. German propaganda could no longer disguise it." Reports sent back to Berlin admitted that Allied air power had become the decisive weapon on the Western Front. Even hardened SS commanders began to restrict movement to nighttime, fearing what daylight would bring. And every soldier who saw the P-47 descend upon his column knew that whatever the newspapers had claimed, the Americans could fly, and they could kill. The myth of the unskilled Yankee pilot had died in smoke and fire. In its place rose something the German army had never experienced before, the feeling of being utterly hunted. Behind every roar of a thunderbolt stood men who understood something new about warfare. That control of the air was not a supporting element, but the central pillar of victory. Among them was General Elwood Pete Quesada, commander of the U.S. 9th Air Force Tactical Air Command. Unlike many traditional air officers, Quesada believed in fusing air and ground forces into a single responsive weapon. He tore down bureaucratic barriers that separated pilots from infantry, insisting that coordination be instant and direct. Under his guidance, the U.S. Army introduced forward air controllers, soldiers on the front line equipped with radios that could call in P-47 strikes within minutes. A tank platoon pinned by German armor could summon help from the sky faster than reinforcements from the rear. This system was revolutionary. While the Luftwaffe was trapped in rigid command structures, the Americans operated like a living organism, ground troops and pilots working as one. Quesada also pushed his pilots to fly from temporary forward airfields, sometimes only a few miles behind the front lines. It was dangerous, dirty work, but it allowed Thunderbolts to deliver near constant pressure. The sky became a continuous extension of Allied artillery. To Quesada, victory was not about air duels or kill counts. It was about tactical impact, destroying movement, choking supply lines, and supporting the soldier who fought in the mud. He called it air power in direct support of the man with the rifle. And under his command, the P-47 became exactly that. For all its effectiveness, there was a darker side to the Thunderbolt's success, a psychological burden that many pilots carried silently. Unlike high-altitude escort missions, ground attack sorties brought pilots face-to-face with the human cost of their actions. From 2,000 feet, they could see the figures running, the chaos erupting, the brief, unmistakable glimpse of men dying. Many pilots later admitted that this type of warfare changed them. They were no longer dueling unseen opponents in the clouds. They were killing soldiers who could look up and see their faces. The U.S. Army Air Forces never spoke openly about it at the time, but letters and diaries reveal the quiet weight many carried. One pilot wrote, "You aim at the tank, not the man. But you see the man anyway. You can't not see him." And yet they kept flying, because every mission meant fewer American boys dying on the ground below. It was the arithmetic of war, brutal but necessary. The German soldiers, too, were crushed under a new kind of fear. For men trained to dominate the battlefield, being powerless under the open sky broke something deep inside. Officers described the Himmelangst and the fear of the heavens, a condition where troops refused to move by day, even when ordered to. By late 1944, German commanders were fighting two enemies, the Allies and their own soldiers' terror of being seen. The moral balance of the war had shifted. The Luftwaffe's pride, once based on precision and discipline, was being dismantled by a relentless force that seemed almost impersonal. The Thunderbolt didn't fight for glory. It fought to erase resistance. And in that cold efficiency, the myth of German air superiority finally died. The Thunderbolt campaign of 1944 didn't just win battles, it rewrote military doctrine. For the first time in history, air power wasn't just a supporting tool. It was the deciding factor in how armies moved, fought, and survived. The Germans could no longer maneuver freely, no matter how skilled their generals were. Every order to move required a question. Is the sky clear? Bridges destroyed by P-47s forced entire divisions to reroute. Rail lines cut by strafing runs stranded tanks without fuel. Trucks carrying food and ammunition were annihilated before reaching the front. Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy, owed much of its success to this strangling of German logistics. When American armor punched through the lines at St. Lo, the German counterattack couldn't form. Its reinforcements were burning on the roads. This was the dawn of modern air-ground integration, the model every army would study after the war. The Thunderbolt proved that technology, coordination, and overwhelming industrial might could replace the old warrior's duel. By the time Allied forces crossed the Seine, the outcome was no longer in doubt. German generals still had their tactics, but America had something more powerful, a sky that obeyed its will. And for the men below, the message was unmistakable. The age of the fighter race was ending. The age of total air dominance had begun. Normandy, July 1944. The hedgerows still burn. Smoke drifts low over the shattered countryside, carrying the smell of oil, gunpowder, and earth. After 6 weeks of grinding combat since D-Day, the Allies have fought inch by inch through the bocage, a maze of fields, stone walls, and ambushes. Now the breakthrough begins. Operation Cobra. The American gamble to break the deadlock and unleash their armor into open country. But to succeed, the enemy must be blinded. The German 7th Army, entrenched along the Saint-Lô-Perrier line, must be paralyzed before the first Sherman tank rolls forward. At dawn on July 25th, the sky opens. Hundreds of bombers roar overhead, carpeting the German defenses in one of the most massive air assaults of the war. Then, as the smoke thickens and the ground quakes, a second sound arrives, deeper, angrier. Thunderbolts. They come in waves, flying low and fast, their wingtips glinting in the sun. Each one carries bombs slung beneath its belly, rockets under its wings. The German front line, already battered, is now exposed to a storm of steel. For hours the sky is a blur of motion. P-47s dive from 10,000 feet, releasing bombs that send shockwaves through the hedgerows. When they climb away, they pivot, line up again, and strafe anything that moves. Trucks, horse teams, command cars. German radio operators scream into their sets, Feindflieger überall. Überall. Enemy planes everywhere. Columns attempting to retreat are shredded. Even armored vehicles, once safe from small arms, are torn open by 5-inch rockets that pierce through steel like paper. One Luftwaffe report from the region read bluntly, "The fighter bombers dominate the battlefield. Movement by day is impossible." The German counterattack, ordered by General Hausser to strike the American flanks, never fully forms. Tanks that do move are spotted within minutes, marked by smoke shells from Allied artillery, and obliterated by Thunderbolts waiting overhead. In the cockpit, an American pilot, Lieutenant Charles D. Morrill of the 405th Fighter Group, later described the scene. "It was like hunting from the sky. You could see the flashes below, the fires spreading across the road. We just kept diving, pulling up, diving again. The road disappeared under smoke. By the evening of July 26th, the German line collapses. The once disciplined formations that Hitler had promised would throw the Americans back into the sea are reduced to scattered survivors hiding under trees, crawling through ditches, praying the next rocket won't find them. The Luftwaffe, once their shield, is nowhere to be seen. Most of its fuel reserves are gone. Its airfields are under constant attack. The handful of German fighters that try to intervene are outnumbered 10 to 1. To the soldiers below, it feels like abandonment. The sky itself now belongs to the enemy. As the Americans pour through the breach, the Thunderbolts follow them every mile. Bridges are bombed to trap retreating Germans. Convoys heading for Avranches and Mortain are smashed. Even supply wagons at night are hunted by flare and moonlight. Every road that once carried the German army now carries its wreckage. By early August, the Allies have achieved what no one thought possible: a full breakout from Normandy. And now, as the Germans attempt to regroup east of the Orne River, another nightmare is forming: the encirclement that will be remembered as the Malaise Pocket. Here, in the narrow valley between Argentan and Chambois, tens of thousands of German soldiers are trapped, a retreating army caught between advancing Allied ground forces and the unrelenting eyes of the Thunderbolts above. Day after day, the sky screams. Pilots fly up to 6 missions a day, strafing the roads where German columns stretch for miles. Tracers rake the fields. Rockets detonate in the ditches. Witnesses say the roads were clogged with dead horses, burning tanks, and men running from fire. Even hardened German officers, veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, admit they have never seen destruction on this scale. One Wehrmacht report called it simply the Valley of Death. And through it all, the Thunderbolts keep coming. Methodical, merciless, unstoppable. The Germans who once called American pilots unskilled now whisper a different name for them: the Sky Killers. But the worst is yet to come, because what happens in the next few days will forever end any illusion of German air dominance and prove to the world that American power has fully arrived. Mid-August 1944, the Malaise Pocket, the hills of Normandy are burning. Columns of black smoke rise into a cloudless sky, twisting like torn fabric over the French countryside. Beneath that pall of smoke, the German army is dying, not in glorious battle, but under relentless fire from above. Nearly 100,000 men, remnants of the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, are trapped in a narrowing corridor barely 10 miles wide. To the west, American and Canadian forces close in. To the east, Polish and British units press forward. And above, from dawn until dusk, the sky belongs entirely to the Thunderbolts. Every attempt to escape becomes a massacre. The roads between Chambois, Troon, and Argentan are jammed with tanks, trucks, wagons, and horses. Ammunition dumps explode as P-47s dive through the haze, firing rockets that tear convoys apart. The shockwaves roll across the valley, echoing off the hills. A German lieutenant later wrote in his diary, "The roads are rivers of fire. We move at night, but the dawn always finds us." The Jabos hunt without rest. The Jabo, the fighter bombers, were everywhere, flying from hastily constructed forward strips in Normandy. Thunderbolt groups struck with mechanical precision. A single squadron could make 6 or 7 sorties a day. The moment a column was spotted, the coordinates were radioed to airborne controllers, and within minutes the air turned to thunder. From the ground, the experience was beyond comprehension. Men clung to the earth as shells and rockets exploded around them. Horses bolted, dragging burning wagons. Trucks overturned, ammunition cooking off in a chain of blinding flashes. One Allied observer flying overhead described the aftermath. "You could walk for miles and never step on grass and only on steel." By August 19th, the German command structure inside the pocket had completely collapsed. Radios were destroyed, units scattered, and commanders killed or missing. What remained of the once proud panzer divisions tried desperately to break out toward the east, but the roads were impassable, littered with wrecks and the dead. The Thunderbolts hunted them without pause. Some pilots later confessed it was difficult even to distinguish targets. So dense was the wreckage that the entire valley looked like a continuous line of burning vehicles. But they kept striking, sortie after sortie, ensuring that nothing that moved survived the day. One German officer described the horror to a captured American after the war. "Your pilots, they circled above us like vultures. We could not run, we could not fight. Only pray that death came quickly." By the evening of August 20th, the Allied ground forces finally closed the pocket. The destruction was total. More than 10,000 Germans were killed, 50,000 captured, and nearly 350 tanks and 2,500 vehicles destroyed, most by air attack. Photographs taken after the battle show roads so thick with wreckage that bulldozers had to clear paths for advancing troops. Tanks were melted into the pavement. Horses lay in lines beside their burned wagons. In some places, the smell of smoke and decay lingered for weeks. For the German army, Falaise was not just a defeat, it was humiliation. The commanders who once boasted that their soldiers were superior, their pilots unmatched, now watched helplessly as their armies were torn apart from the air. Even the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was silent. By mid-1944, it had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force in the West. Its fuel reserves were gone, its pilots dead or captured, its bases cratered by bombing. The same air force that once ruled the skies over France in 1940 could now barely lift a squadron to resist. American airmen flew home from these missions exhausted, their nerves raw, their hands shaking. But they understood what they had achieved. They had turned air power into the decisive weapon of the modern battlefield, not by elegance or heroism, but by coordination, precision, and sheer unstoppable momentum. For Germany, it was the end of an era, the death of the myth that skill alone could defeat industry. From the wreckage of Falaise, one truth echoed across Europe. The Americans, once mocked for inexperience, had become masters of the sky. And the Thunderbolt, that ungainly heavy machine, had become a symbol of inevitability. The unskilled pilots had rewritten the art of war. But even victory came at a cost, and what followed in the weeks after Falaise would reveal both the triumph and the toll of this new kind of warfare. When the guns finally fell silent over Normandy, the land itself bore witness to the scale of destruction. The roads through Chambois and Troon were no longer roads at all. They were graveyards of twisted metal and burned corpses. The air still carried the acrid stench of fuel and scorched flesh. Allied soldiers advancing through the valley were struck silent. One American sergeant later recalled, "It wasn't a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse." The Malaise Pocket marked the virtual annihilation of the German 7th Army and the collapse of Hitler's defense in France. Those who survived stumbled eastward, disorganized and starving, many without weapons or transport. Thousands surrendered without resistance, their eyes hollow, their boots worn through. For the Allies, the victory was both a military triumph and a psychological one. The nightmare of D-Day's uncertainty was over. The way to Paris, and ultimately the German border, now lay open. But behind that success was an unmistakable truth. It was the dominion of the air that had made it possible. In headquarters across Europe, analysts began to quantify what the pilots had done. Between June and August 1944, American Thunderbolts and British Typhoons had flown tens of thousands of sorties, destroying not only tanks and vehicles but entire logistics networks. Bridges, railways, and fuel depots had been systematically erased. Without them, the German army had ceased to function as a modern force. The P-47 Thunderbolt, originally designed as a high-altitude escort, had become something else entirely. In the fields of Normandy, it evolved into a tank-busting, ground-dominating weapon, capable of delivering destruction with clinical precision. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns could tear through trucks, troop convoys, and light armor in seconds. Its rocket payloads turned even heavy panzers into wrecks. Pilots learned to swoop in at low angles, release at the last moment, and climb away through smoke and shrapnel. A deadly dance repeated hundreds of times a day. What astonished German survivors most wasn't the accuracy. It was the relentlessness. No matter how many times they regrouped, no matter how well they camouflaged, the Jabos returned. At dawn, at noon, at dusk, the droning thunder in the sky never ceased. The Luftwaffe's inability to respond deepened the psychological wound. German soldiers spoke of looking up and seeing the silver shapes crossing overhead, unchallenged as if mocking them. One veteran of the 12th SS Panzer Division later said, "We feared the Jabos more than tanks. You could hide from armor. You could not hide from the sky." For American pilots, however, victory carried its own scars. Each sortie was a tightrope between survival and annihilation. Low-level attacks exposed them to small arms fire, flak bursts, and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure. Many never returned, shot down by invisible gunners or lost in the smoke. Ground crews often waited in silence, counting the empty spaces on the flight line at dusk. For them, each missing plane was a name, a bunk left untouched, a laughter gone from the mess tent. Yet even amid the loss, a new kind of confidence emerged. The airmen who had once been dismissed as green now flew with quiet authority. They had learned to adapt, to coordinate, to dominate through teamwork and endurance rather than bravado. By late August, Allied commanders openly acknowledged that the P-47 had become the backbone of tactical air power in Europe. In the reports compiled after the battle, the U.S. 9th Air Force concluded, "The Thunderbolt has proven itself the most effective weapon against ground targets available to this command." But beyond statistics and reports, the victory at Falaise revealed something deeper. A turning point not just in strategy, but in psychology. The Americans were no longer the inexperienced newcomers of 1942. They were now the professionals, and the world knew it. The same Luftwaffe officers who had once mocked them now watched in disbelief as their own columns burned. The myth of German air superiority had been buried in the fields of Normandy, under the smoke and wreckage left by Thunderbolts. And yet the true measure of the battle's impact would not be seen in France alone, but in the way it shaped the road to Germany itself. Because what began as a tactical victory in August would soon unleash a relentless aerial campaign that carried the war across the Rhine and into the heart of the Reich. In the weeks following Falaise, the Allied armies surged forward like a released tide. Paris fell on August 25th, and by September, American armor was racing toward the borders of Belgium and Germany. The world saw the victory as a triumph of courage and numbers, but inside Allied headquarters, commanders knew that it had been the air war that unlocked France. Reports from the U.S. 9th and 12th Air Forces were staggering. Between D-Day and the end of August 1944, Thunderbolt units had destroyed or damaged more than 86,000 vehicles, 6,000 tanks, and 9,000 locomotives. Fuel convoys, rail junctions, and bridges had been reduced to ash. Without supplies, the German war machine had bled to death before it ever reached the front lines. This was not luck. It was the culmination of years of learning, the transformation of the American air arm from a defensive escort force into an offensive instrument of annihilation. The Thunderbolt's power came not from elegance but from endurance. It could absorb punishment that would tear lesser fighters apart. Pilots returned with wings shredded, canopies cracked, and engines smoking, yet still managed to land. That toughness allowed them to dive through flak and debris again and again, day after day until no target remained. German intelligence units, once dismissive, began reporting the P-47 as a priority threat. Field commanders warned their troops, "If you see the Jabos, scatter. Do not group, do not fire back, run." By autumn 1944, that fear had become institutional. Convoys refused to move in daylight. Armored divisions waited for nightfall to reposition. Even retreating units abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot to avoid being spotted from the air. The Thunderbolt had achieved what few weapons ever could. It had paralyzed an entire army's will to move. But that dominance came at a steep human cost. The attrition among fighter-bomber squadrons was severe. Each mission demanded total precision. A single misjudged dive could send a pilot into the ground at over 400 miles per hour. Others were shot down by flak, their aircraft bursting into flames before they could eject. Survivors often spoke of the loneliness of flying low alone into walls of fire. One pilot described it simply: it wasn't glory. It was work, deadly necessary work. And yet, through that relentless work, the character of the American Air Force was forged. The young men who had arrived in Europe barely trained now returned as veterans of the sky. Calm, methodical, unflinching. Their success reshaped how the Allies viewed war itself. Ground and air ceased to be separate worlds. They became one synchronized machine, what future generations would call combined arms warfare. Tanks advanced only when the Jabos cleared the roads. Infantry moved under their shadow. Supply lines lived or died by their protection. By the winter of 1944, as the front lines approached the German border, the Thunderbolts had become a permanent fixture above every major battle: Aachen, the Hürtgen Forest, the Ardennes. Even during the surprise German offensive at the Battle of the Bulge, when weather grounded most aircraft, Allied soldiers prayed not for reinforcements, but for the skies to clear. They knew what followed when the Thunderbolts returned. When the clouds finally broke in late December, the roar came back, familiar, low, and endless. In hours, the counterattack began. Convoys burned again. The German momentum evaporated. The lesson was unmistakable. Air dominance wasn't support, it was supremacy. The same Germans who once claimed that American pilots lacked skill now faced the reality that skill alone could not stop mass, precision, and discipline united in one unstoppable force. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Thunderbolt had flown over 1.2 million combat missions and dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, more than any other fighter in the Allied arsenal. Its pilots had proven something greater than tactical prowess. They had shown that technology and human resolve, when bound together, could reshape the fate of nations. And yet, beyond the ruins of Europe, their story carried a quieter echo. Of the young men who had once been underestimated, who rose from inexperience to mastery, and who changed the sky itself. The world they left behind was forever marked by the thunder of their wings. When the smoke finally cleared over Europe, silence fell in places where sound had ruled for years. The roads once carved by burning convoys grew over with grass. The wrecks rusted into the soil. And in that quiet, history began to measure what the Thunderbolt had really accomplished. It had not been the most graceful aircraft nor the fastest. It was heavy, loud, and unrefined, an iron beast built for endurance, not elegance. Yet it became the perfect weapon for a new kind of war. Its brute strength matched the industrial heart of the nation that built it. Through it, America proved that mastery in battle was not born of arrogance or heritage, but of adaptation, learning, and will. The German aces had entered the war believing themselves unmatched. But the men in those silver P-47s learned from every loss, refined every tactic, and turned every mission into a lesson. In time, experience outweighed reputation. The story of the Thunderbolt is not simply about destruction. It is about transformation, of technology, of strategy, and of the men who flew it. From the skies of Normandy to the borders of Germany, it symbolized a generation that refused to remain underestimated. Every roar of its engine was a declaration that the tide of war, and of history, had turned. And though the pilots eventually returned home, their legacy remained in the doctrine of every air force that followed. The principles born in the fire of Normandy, precision, coordination, and overwhelming presence, became the foundation of modern aerial warfare. In the end, the German claim that American pilots lacked skill dissolved in the smoke above the battlefields they once ruled. Because in the final reckoning, it was not skill alone that defined victory. It was persistence. Persistence that turned young, untested men into masters of the sky. Persistence that turned a single-engine fighter into the most feared sound on the battlefield. Persistence that reshaped the very meaning of power in war. And somewhere in the quiet fields of France, if one listens closely, the echo remains, a distant rolling thunder. The sound of the Thunderbolt, the sound of a new era being born.